Every now and then, as a reviewer, you run into a game that you hadn't originally planned to cover. Literally every single day at this point, I get at least a handful of new review key offers from various developers and/or publishers. Most of them end up being little more than low-effort trash, which is why I never use them in 90% of cases, so it's easy in a sense when you're being bogged down by all of that, to miss out on covering a game while it's still new and trending. For me, Genshin Impact is one of those games. I only noticed it recently on YouTube and after doing some digging, and thus finding out the game had released last year, in September 2020, I immediately began wondering why none of the normal review channels I follow had covered it yet. So after a good 20 to 30 hours of playing it, here we are. Genshin Impact, for those of you who might not be aware, is an online third-person RPG. It is not an MMORPG, just to be clear. While it can be played in a cooperative setting with a group of up to 4 players, you will not be interacting with any other random players within the world. I played it personally entirely as a single-player campaign, so I'm going to be primarily discussing it from that point of view. I cannot speak to the quality of the co-op online functionality. Before we go any further, it's worth noting 2 things. Number 1, this review will be longer than most because there is a lot to cover, and number 2, even with that said, I still will not be able to discuss every single thing worth noting about this game, because in some regards there is simply so much here to analyze that were I to go out of my way and cover every little thing, we would still be sitting here easily an hour from now. This is kind of why I haven't covered games like Red Dead Redemption 2 on my channel, although I really did consider it and I actually did buy the game. Some games are simply too beastly in size for me to even consider reviewing at all. So instead we're going to narrow the range of this discussion a little bit, and instead just focus on the more prominent key elements. As with any RPG-centric game, there is a story element tying it all together, and just like basically any other anime or manga of Eastern origin, it's over-sophisticated for the sake of over-sophistication. Genshin Impact takes place in the world of Teyvat, a place I hope I pronounced correctly. If not, fuck it, we're going with this anyway. A continent composed of 7 distinct nations. In addition to these nations, there is this additional mysterious floating island which is allegedly home to the gods and mortals who have ascended to godhood through great heroic feats. Kind of a twist on the Norse mythological concept of Valhalla, or Elysium from Greek mythology. The player character, the Traveler, got him over getting Destiny 2 flashbacks from just hearing that name, is separated from their twin, and you find yourself trapped on Teyvat. You're joined on your quest to save the damsel in distress sibling by your companion, Paimon, who basically follows you around as the Genshin Impact equivalent of Jar Jar Binks. Yeah, I'm just going to go on a side tangent here and state what seems to be a universal truth expressed by the majority of the Genshin Impact community, from what I've seen online, and when I've talked to some of my friends that play as well. The idea of having a companion fairy is hardly a new one in an RPG. Legend of Zelda has been doing that on its own for decades. And that's only one popular example, there are tons of others as well. But Paimon herself is an annoying pain in the ass to listen to. Now, I really don't want to blame the voice actor for this. She was paid to do a specific, squeaky, bubbly kind of voice, but it is probably one of the most annoying things I've had to listen to in an RPG for an extended period of time. And as she has more voice lines than basically any other single character in the entire bloody game, it just makes it all indescribably worse. The only time I've ever found Paimon even remotely funny was whenever the player and Paimon would meet a new playable or non-playable character, and they would just almost all by default assume the player was only keeping Paimon around to cook her up as an edible snack. It's one of the only recurring jokes in the game, and probably one of the only jokes in general that actually proves to be somewhat funny, even if it's only meriting a chuckle. From here on out, the story gets a lot more complicated. To sum it up in the simplest of terms, through a series of seemingly unrelated adventures, you form a diverse team of characters. And by diverse, I do not mean binary factors like their skin color, but the kind of diversity that actually matters. Their individuality, their personalities, their skill sets, their motivations, and their positions within the world. You know, the kind of thing that makes them an actual functioning human being. While the dialogue writing tends to lean in the direction of being oversimplified at times, Every character maintains their own unique identity. Each character's personality shines through in their dialogue. Some characters are aggressive and will generally advocate for violent solutions to a problem and show disinterest or sometimes even contempt for other party characters that advocate a more passive approach. Sadly, there isn't any choice-based dialogue system which would really influence your relationship with these characters. The game will often present you with 2 or more dialogue choice options, but both of them almost always lead to the same exact outcome and have little to no noticeable effect on character relationship statuses, which really begs the question as to why the game presents you with even 2 choices to begin with, when one is really just the true choice and the other one is little more than a desert mirage, a fake choice in essence that just feeds right back into the true one. This is basically what Telltale did in their games, but at least Telltale pretended to give a shit about the concept by implementing the now memed to death so-and-so will remember that dialogue text, and adding in a mechanic that would enable you to see how many other players picked the same dialogue choices, as opposed to what percentage of other players picked the alternative choice. Given how Genshin already has like a dozen different in-game menus the player will be frequently looking through, it's not like they couldn't have added this as a fun feature for those who really dig getting into the whole roleplay experience. I mean, it's hard to brand your game as an RPG if you don't do a whole lot to justify having the RP label in the first place. As with a lot of RPG games that feature multiple playable characters, we do have character classes, so to speak, each of whom, for the most part, revolve around a certain natural element as a main component of their character. These include fire, frost, earth, mysticism, etc. I know mysticism is like the odd duck out of that assembly, but I suppose by now we should all accept that having some kind of magic system or mechanics is a given when we're talking about a Eastern-made RPG game, or really just RPG games in general. There's a lot of focus placed on exploring the fairly sizable open world in this game. Initially, the portion of the map you start off in is very small, but by exploring outward into unknown territory, towards the specific checkmarks marked on your map, which once you reach them, you can clearly see as these god statues. All you have to do is walk up to it and interact with it, and the entire territory it protects or represents, I'm not sure what the right word for that would be, would become immediately available to you. The entire new chunk of the map would become visible to you, including new fast travel points you can unlock, dungeons you can venture into, and other open world activities. Also, unlocking and eventually upgrading these statues increases your maximum stamina, allowing you to run farther. Granted, these increases are so minimal in nature that you'll probably need to gain around half a dozen of them or so in order to notice any substantial overall difference. Now, this opens up 2 related points of discussion, being dungeons and how leveling works within the game. I'll start with dungeons, since going into dungeons is something you'll do quite often early into the game, and again doubly so when you're far more leveled up, as there is quite a bit of advanced quasi-endgame type of dungeon content. If you've ever played an RPG before, I'm fairly positive you're at least vaguely aware of how dungeons work. At least the concept. If not, just to give the briefest of recaps, dungeons, arguably just like Genshin Impact as a whole, are instanced. To play a dungeon, you, and if you're with your friends, them too, enter a separate lobby and the game places your own server to prevent other players from interfering and stealing dropped loot, and just in general ruining the experience for you, among other reasons. In dungeons, you defeat groups of enemies, solve environmental puzzles, and or successfully complete platforming sections, etc., before going up against a final boss in a climactic battle. I wasn't a big fan of dungeons here in Genshin. Some of the boss battles were fairly fun, some of the environmental and platforming puzzles, albeit on the simplistic side, were decent enough. Fighting off normal enemies, whatever. It's almost always the same handful of enemies over and over again. The dungeons need a bit more variety to really justify extended play, at least from where I'm standing. I'm not the kind of player to replay the same exact bloody dungeon again and again and again and again, etc. on and on and on, but just for the mere chance of getting some exotic or legendary type loot. That's not my style. Maybe it's yours, and that's fair, but for me, When it comes to dungeons, I generally prefer some kind of randomization, even if it doesn't physically affect the dungeon itself. I don't need the map itself to change, basically, but changing up even somewhat smaller details would have increased the replay value for me. Like, I'll give an example. Dead by Daylight, great game by the way, is a good example of what I'm thinking of. While Dead by Daylight as a game belongs to an entirely different genre than Genshin, being a asymmetric multiplayer 1v5 PvP game, it has this mechanic where a handful of random attributes are applied at the start of the match, all having indirectly positive or negative effects that favor one team over the other, either the survivors or the killer. In general, though, all of these have a noticeable effect on the gameplay. I think Genshin's dungeons would have benefited from a bit more diversity along these lines. Taking the Dead by Daylight approach, you could, using a new randomization system, say, you know what, instead of facing slime, you have a greater chance of facing elite enemies. Or basic enemies now deal increased damage, but their attack speed is slower. I don't know, you change things around. You give players different ways of experiencing the game. You make everything feel new and fresh every time the player walks into the dungeon. If an RPG game can do that, for me, that'd be amazing. Again, it's a different kind of play, but for me, that's what I enjoy. So, Genshin Impact, as far as dungeons go, Dungeons by default should feel like a more challenging and condensed version of what you find in the open world. But in reality, while it still feels condensed, very little of it ever really feels challenging. So whether the solution is, like I mentioned, to sprinkle in a bit of RNG, or just to flush out the dungeon cast of enemies, I'm not sure, maybe both. But the dungeons in this game are only passable, at best. Some kind of overhaul is needed for me to really declare them as good, let alone great. Now, moving on to the leveling process. There is a twofold approach to leveling in Genshin, being respectively a player's adventure level and their individual character level. Your adventure level is the most important one, overall, which largely determines what in-game content you have access to. Playing through story missions seems to be the best way of earning adventure level experience points, although doing side quests as well as engaging in open world exploration, and in general doing open world related activities can all be a good accompanying way of grinding for adventure level XP as well. Here's where we get into the big but of that. In hindsight, for the record, I have nothing against big butts, you do you. That was just an unfortunate selection of words. That said, the major drawback, I guess, of how leveling works in Genshin is that you very quickly find yourself excessively grinding in order to attain a higher adventure level, as early as level 12. While I don't have a huge problem with grind in RPG games in order to level up, this I generally associate with upper higher levels. Like if we're talking about an RPG game with your traditional 1 through 99 leveling hierarchy, I expect grind to slowly escalate to the point that come level 60 or so, you're really having to spend the vast majority of your time grinding in raids and similar content repetitively in order to level up even once. Forcing that kind of grind as early as arguably around adventure level 12 is way too early. Keep in mind that I am at least glad that the developers haven't, as of now, gone the Ubisoft route and done this for the sake of adding premium XP boosters to the game to create this fast lane, slow lane ecosystem of premium player progression. But still, I don't like the fact that I'm basically here half-heartedly praising the game for having a feature that's mediocre instead of horribly corrupt. Genshin Impact currently has a level cap of level 63. Although the developers have said that they plan to increase the level cap in future content updates. Leveling characters is pretty easy for the most part, as doing basically anything in the world will gain that character XP, until it comes to enhancing one of your characters, in which case you need to basically combine a number of increasingly rare material. Enhancing a character will allow them to continue leveling up another 20 levels. Otherwise, they'll be unable to proceed farther. For example, if you do not enhance them at level 20, they'll never be able to take in any more XP and go up to level 21, let alone level 40. I had very little trouble acquiring the materials to enhance my characters at level 20, but I imagine at level 40 it's not going to be anywhere as easy. I've already got 2 characters edging fairly close to level 40 now, so I'm already trying to get my ducks in order so I can be ready to enhance them. On a related note, I just want to touch on the combat for a bit. I've already mentioned how characters are divided into certain categories based on what elemental type they represent. Their individual character abilities also really tie into that. Each character has their own elemental ability and their own elemental burst. Elemental abilities act in a similar function to Overwatch's ultimate abilities, which are built up over time as the player deals damage to enemies. Elemental bursts likewise can be compared to your standard secondary Overwatch E attack ability, which usually deals damage and helps speed up the recharge time of your ultimate ability. There are other more relevant examples that I could come up with, but I just picked Overwatch because the majority of gamers are at least somewhat familiar with how it plays. The most effective way to play in combat is generally to deal damage with one character, exhaust their burst damage, get a few hits in with basic damage, quick swap to another character, do the same, etc. That way you're constantly getting characters up to their ultimate. You use it, you swap to another character, you get them up to the ultimate, you use that, you move on. While you could primarily play as one specific character, combat engagements tend to go a lot faster if you rapidly swap between characters to maximize your potential damage output, especially if you combine character abilities for devastating effect. I personally don't really care about spamming the character swap feature unless I'm fighting a boss or some group of elite enemies, as otherwise it ends combat way too quickly, kind of sucking the fun out of it, at least for me. But to each their own. Health regeneration is not a thing in this game. Instead, players have to buy or cook their own food in order to heal. The open world has plenty of campfires allowing you to do exactly that. And at first, while the number of food options is a bit limited, you do gradually begin to expand your culinary horizons with new recipe unlocks. Food recipes are generally tied to the adventure level system, although there are some that are earned via story missions, and others that can be bought from vendors even early on. The process of food cooking is presented via a QuickTime event minigame. I think we can all agree QuickTime events as a gameplay mechanic have gone the way of the dodo, and rightfully so, but here there's at least an easy workaround. Once you've successfully learned how to make the same food at least 5 times using the QTE system, your character will be able to just instantly make the food in the future, assuming you have the necessary ingredients at the time. In order to find those ingredients, you'll need to keep an eye out during the open world exploring. Most of them aren't really all that hard to find and stick out in plain sight more often than not. One less thing to excessively grind for, I suppose. At this point, I have like at least a dozen duplicates of nearly every food dish that can be made at my current adventure level. I won't really get into any more specifics about the whole cooking element of the game. This is just a brief overview. There is a little bit more complexity there, so if you think it's inherently shallow based on my description, no, not really. It's just that I'm keeping things brief for the sake of keeping my own sanity in check. Cities and towns in the game operate something akin to how they would in any other RPG or MMORPG, just on a more micro scale here. You've got shops and traders you can purchase supplies from, a forge where you can craft certain weapons and refine specific minerals and materials, etc. The atmosphere in these towns and cities is really amazing, but from a gameplay perspective, you're only likely to spend a few minutes at a time hanging out in them, as there honestly isn't a whole lot to do, despite what the misleading size may lead you to believe. That said, now that I think we've covered pretty much everything else, let's talk about everyone's favorite bit of the conversation, and yes, I was being sarcastic there, the microtransactions. To no one's surprise at all at this point, yes indeed, we do have loot boxes. And yes, they feature content that can actually be counted as gameplay affecting, so if you're one of those people that say, loot boxes never matter if it's only cosmetic, I fucking dare you to try to argue your way out of this one. In this game, you can use either the in-game free currency to unlock said loot boxes or the premium currency associated with said unlocks. Genshin Impact has not one but a handful of premium currencies, as well as an additional hybrid form of currency, which can be gained from either free or premium bought loot boxes, which is earned by opening loot boxes in the game. While some characters can be unlocked through in-game progression and by using freely earned in-game money, the current system is inherently designed to favor those who spend real-life money, and there's evidence to suggest this. There's quite an excellent article in the Wall Street Journal that went into this. I'll link it below if I remember to do so. The game openly advertises that while you could try your luck with individual loot boxes, basically giving players the option of being a dumpster diver trying to find value in mostly useless or low-value items, you can alternatively buy 10 loot boxes at once to guarantee yourself at least one new unlocked premium character. However, you'll need about 1,600 Primo Gems to do so. Unfortunately, the in-game premium store doesn't allow you to directly buy 1,600 Primo Gems. However, you can buy 1,980 for $29.99 USD. That's right, for roughly the same price as most mid-tier AA standard industry-made games, you can unlock a grand total of one playable character in Genshin Impact. And the thing is, I should clarify something. You have a guarantee of unlocking a character, but you do not have a guarantee that you will unlock new character. You could quite easily instead find yourself getting a duplicate of a character you already have. Of course, statistically, this isn't going to be much of an issue for you if you have a fairly small roster of characters. But the more characters you unlock, and whether for free or by paying, the higher the likelihood of you receiving a duplicate drop. Now, I'm not a fan of that. It's worth noting that in my entire time spent playing the game, the only microtransaction I personally bought was the $4.99 Blessings of the Welkin Moon Pack, which granted me 300 Genesis crystals up front, as well as 90 Primo Gems every day, for a total of 30 days. In all honesty, I can readily say I didn't need the additional currency per se. While it does make it slightly easier to unlock heroes, weapons, and other content, I'd already unlocked half a dozen new playable characters completely for free just by using the in-game currency. And that's not including the couple other characters I unlocked so far just by playing through the story campaign. There are tons of playable hero characters in the game, so while unlocking each and every one would take an agonizingly long time if you're just relying on the free in-game currency, if you were just looking to unlock enough characters to enjoy the game it was meant to be played, aka you'd be satisfied with 6 or 7 in total, I can promise you that you'll be easily able to unlock that many before you've even unlocked online co-op at adventure level 16. Assuming you take advantage of the daily and weekly login bonuses as well as the in-game daily quests. One might make the argument that by me buying into this one lesser microtransaction, I'm openly endorsing the rest, and I can kind of see the reasoning for that argument. It's a very on the slippery slope argument. It's an argument based on the slippery slope logical fallacy. But I feel it could also apply in instances where you buy the base version of a game as multiple digital collector's editions. It's like if you bought the third Hitman game at $60, are you thereby condoning people who buy at $90? I don't know, I think that's an interesting discussion to have. By buying any version of X, you're supporting Y. And I could see how some people might forego games like this that have these microtransactions, but from my point of view, the developers have provided me a few dozen hours of entertainment so far, and probably will provide me a few dozen more. So I'm not entirely against supporting the game, in the hope that it leads to more free content updates for everyone, whether they support the game themselves or not, and I'm perfectly fine if they don't. Genshin Impact is a pretty fantastic game, which as a free-to-play game, offers more content and value than most AAA $60 games I've seen in recent years. It definitely has a few notable flaws, primarily being its over-the-top monetization policy, but in hindsight at this point, I've played so many games as a reviewer that I almost unconsciously slip into analytical mode every time I play, sometimes to the point that it becomes a little harder to fully enjoy what's right in front of me. This is by no means a perfect game, I'm not going to excuse its faults, but to be fair, I would dare you to point me to any game that really is these days. I don't think there's ever been such a thing as a perfect game, at the very least not in recent years. But all the same, I couldn't help really enjoying what's on display here. Like I said from the start, I'm not really much of an anime or manga person. I personally don't have a whole lot of love for the genre outside of maybe Studio Ghibli films, but let's be honest, those are so beloved by even mainstream film audiences that they might as well be considered the beginner's introduction to anime at this point. So I am not the quote-unquote intended audience for this game, strictly speaking. So if you're worried about this just being another anime game, I get it. It has the art style, but it actually has more in common with your typical RPG. The anime overtones just disguise that fact pretty well. So yeah, I mean, I definitely would recommend giving Genshin a go. I would even go so far as to call it one of the most enjoyable games I played in the last year. That's saying a lot. I play a lot of games. It's a game that just for whatever reason appeals to me as a somewhat casual player at times. It's a game I can play as long as I want to, sometimes for just 10 or 20 minutes at a time, and other times for up to 5 to 6 hour long binges. And I enjoy that flexibility. I think it just depends on what you're looking for from this game. I'm very excited to see the game continue to evolve over the coming weeks, months, and hopefully years. Play through all that new content the first opportunity I get, and potentially make follow-up videos on it in the future, just like I do with a handful of other games on the channel. But on that note, I turn the conversation over to you. What do you think of Genshin Impact? Does the game appeal to you? No? Let me know. Would you consider playing it? Or for those of you that have already tried playing it, tell me, what adventure rank are you up to? What's your opinion on the state of the game? Right, my voice is dying, so I'm gonna wrap it here. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the work I do here on this channel, do consider subscribing and click the notification bell to opt into getting notifications so you can be among the first to know when a new video goes live. Otherwise, YouTube will not always tell you when I upload a new video. So I know the whole subscribe and click the bell phrase is basically a meme here on YouTube. It honestly does help out smaller channels like mine survive, so if you could do that, it'd be big. I'd appreciate it. As ever, thank you very much to my existing subscribers. I don't want you to ever feel your support doesn't make an impact. It absolutely does. Without your continued support, I would have given up on this channel long ago. We're only a little more than 30 subscribers away from 1,200, 1,200 subscribers right now, so if we can hit that sooner rather than later, that would be very much appreciated. Ideally, I'd love to hit that by February 14th, both because it seems like a safe estimate, and secondarily because I would very much find it funny if Valentine's Day was when I next crossed a subscriber milestone. Leaving a comment and sharing this video around are the two best ways to help this channel grow. So even if you do only one and not the other, you'll have made a very valuable and meaningful contribution. With that said, I think that's as good a place to end as any. Thanks again, everybody. See you all next time with a new review soon. This is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome, everybody. Stay safe and peace out.